Hello, welcome to RC Video Reviews. Today, the FAA put out their final rules for remote ID, and it is a long document. It's 470 pages, and I've gone through the book basically top to bottom. I didn't read every single page. I had to do some summarization in order to get some material put together for you guys, but I did go through and pull out what I believe to be the more informative points for RC pilots. There's a lot of minutia in this document. There's a lot of governance, a lot of justification on where they derive the power to do this kind of regulating in a bureaucracy. They do some financial analysis. They talk quite a bit about the removal of the network requirement. But they also cover a lot of what I would consider to be definitions and guidance on where they interacted with the community, where they interacted with the agencies and companies that were invited to submit comments or to sit in their roundtable sessions. And they also covered a lot in there about the public request for comments that they held as well. So there's a great deal to cover, and I just want to get into it. Let's get started right away. Before I go any further, I do have to point out that I'm not a lawyer. Right. So I'm just going to be very clear. This is not legal advice. If you're in the US and you're subject to US law, you need to read these regulations on your own. You need to interpret them for yourself, and you're responsible for your own actions and for compliance. So I just have to be clear about that. I am not a lawyer. These are my opinions based on my reading of the material. I do not represent the FAA or any law enforcement agency or any legal entity. So the opinions contained from here on out are my opinions. That's it. That's all you get. They're free. I do want to let you know that the FAA government press release on the final rules, I believe I have it in the description, but if not, I'll make sure it's in the description after I post the video. There's a link on the chart that you can see in front of you on where I found these final rules, and then all the material within. So this is an unusual PowerPoint. Normally, when I do professional PowerPoints, I don't use material like this. Normally, what I do is just the secret's in the title, right? You do PowerPoints, and because there's so much legal mumbo jumbo in here, what I opted to do was leave the legalese in there, and I put some bold text around what I consider to be the salient points. Okay, so that way you have a page number that you can refer to, you have the body of text where I found the information, and I just put in bold what I think are the most relevant or salient points. So that way you understand this is not my interpretation. I'm not coming up with any of this. This is just what I took off the book. So thanks you guys for checking in. I got Philip. Hey, Philip, Jet Screamer, X-Jet. Are we there yet? Can I drive? I'm hungry. Hey, the X-Jet. Oh, that's cool. Good to see you, Bruce. Love your work, man. Let's do this. Mad Sloper, you can't drive, Bruce. Damn it, Mad Sloper, Jason Wright. Okay, so a lot of chit chat. Let's get moving. Let's get moving on the content. I just want to get the disclaimers out of the way. Okay, the most fundamental thing, and for those of you who have the attention span of a tadpole, this is the chart you need to understand. And I put this up front just so if you want to just say, tell me what I need to know so I can go back to my video game, here's what you need to know. When you are using your remotely operated aircraft, there are three ways you can comply. The first one is using what they call a standard remote identification. And what this will be is the remote ID that will be baked into commercial offers. So when you buy, starting 18 months from now, when you buy a DJI or a Hubs and Zeno Pro or any of the other commercial offerings out there, those UASs will be required to provide what they call standard remote identification. So when you see that phrase, standard remote identification, they're talking about commercially produced products, okay? The second way is by attaching a remote identification broadcast module. And this one's kind of new. They haven't talked a lot about this in the past, but this is kind of new. So attaching a remote identification broadcast module is a way you can retrofit your existing fleet of airplanes to be compliant with remote ID. So you can connect one of these broadcast modules to an unmanned aircraft that's not able to otherwise broadcast. So in other words, you don't have a flight computer, you don't have an INAV computer, you don't have a DJI NASA or DJI flight computer that can't otherwise broadcast the information. We'll get into that later, but if you can't broadcast that information, this is a way of retrofitting what you already have. And then the third way you can comply is by operating in what they call a FRIA, or an FAA recognized identification area. Bottom line, in the current set of rulemaking, that means an AMA field, or will be an AMA field. That's the preponderance of evidence. It leans to AMA fields. For Canadians, it'll be MAC fields, and it'll be any other community-based organization. And by the way, I have to emphasize that what I'm talking about here are U.S. rules. However, I fully expect the basis of the U.S. rules to find their way elsewhere. So even if you're not a U.S. pilot, understand that what you're seeing here will likely show up in your country as at least in some form or fashion. So in the U.S., it's AMA, or the Academy of Nautical Aeronautics. They are widely recognized as the CBO, or community-based organization. So the FAA recognized identification areas are going to probably be the AMA fields, which they made some exceptions for them that weren't in the original proposed rulemaking, which is great. And they also added educational institutions. So colleges, universities, primary schools, they're all included in fields or locations that will be allowed to apply for an FAA recognized identification area. Okay, so those are three primary methods of compliance. Okay, you can ask, why did they do this? And again, here's where you're going to get into all the legalese. I put what I viewed to be the salient points in bold. So they did this to provide identification, location, and performance information that people on the ground and other airspace users can have. So they envision that fixed wing or helicopters, for example, might be able to put these receivers in to let them know where the unmanned aerial aircraft are operating. And it also is meant for law enforcement. One of the key things we'll touch on in a little bit is in the broadcast model, they talk about using the ISM bands or frequencies that are readily available on channels that are available on things like smartphones and tablets. So you can expect the bands for this broadcast thing to be working in the 915, 868 if you're outside the US, 2.4, 5.8, and so on. Those will be the bands that we expect the broadcast modules to operate in. In its most basic form, remote ID can be described as electronic identification, or what they call a digital license plate. It permits the FAA and law enforcement to conduct oversight. That's the bottom line here. In my opinion, this is about oversight. It's about providing oversight. Other types of actions are needed to mitigate safety or security risk and foster increased compliance with regulations. So the idea here is that it's almost like I guess the best way to think of it is it's that digital license plate in the sky. Law enforcement can't pull over a drone, so you have to broadcast what your information is so they know who you are. The unfortunate part is it also includes information about where you are, and that's something I'm not too sure about. Okay, if you object, too bad. That bottom line here, too bad. The most common objections they got during the proposed rulemaking process is that it imposes financial burdens and costs that'll make it difficult or impossible for hobbyists to fly. And the FAA, they said, yeah, we understand that. That's too bad. But that's the bottom line here. So it doesn't matter if you don't like this or not. You are subject to it if you fly aircraft in the in regulated airspace within the United States. That's the bottom line. All right. Regarding conformity, a lot of folks involved believe the rule will be unenforceable. This is where I land. I really think they've got a problem with enforceability. They say that this is like gun control, right? I have this favorite story that I talk about with gun control, in the US. If you're a bank robber and you've decided, you resolved yourself to rob a bank, and you get your hood and you get your guns, you get your getaway car, you get your game plan, and you go to the bank and you have your gun, you're all loaded, you walk up to the bank door and you see a sign on the door that says, "No guns permitted." The bank robber doesn't say, "Ah, crap, we got to go to another bank that don't allow guns inside." That's the problem I see with this. The people who will conform will be the people who follow the laws. I mean, but that's the nature of law, right? That's kind of the nature of things. The rule will do nothing to change the behavior of bad actors. So these goofballs who fly their drones on the approach end of a commercial airport so they can watch the jets land, they're not going to change their behavior. And I don't think that the remote ID rules are going to change their behavior either. To me, that's always the kind of slippery slope you get into when it comes to making rules. So there were commenters that expressed concerns for widespread noncompliance with the rule. And by the way, the FAA even stipulates later in the documentation, they anticipate the only way this works is with compliance. If there's no compliance, it's not going to work. So they do recommend, or they acknowledge that later on in the documentation. Their response to those commenters is they do not agree that the requirements are unenforceable. In fact, the enforcement mechanism for this rule will parallel existing regulatory compliance activities for manned aviation. But I'm going to be honest with you, compliance activities for manned aviation, they're just not scaled for it. They're going to rely on local law enforcement, which brings in a whole new range of questions. For example, how does a local police officer understand if what you're doing is illegal? By looking at it. If he's not on your FPV goggles, or he's not seeing what you're seeing, and all he's got is a long altitude and airspeed, how does he know what you're doing is not safe? I mean, that's problematic as far as I'm concerned. So anyway, conformity, it's going to be interesting. And I've maintained for a very long time, those of you who attend my live streams or participate in the channel, you know that I've said this over and over. It's not an issue until it's an issue. And once there's an issue, for example, once you take your video of you behaving badly and you put it on YouTube, then you're going to have a problem. You crash your drone into a stadium filled with people, then you're going to have a problem. So I think that's where it's going to go on conformity, but it's interesting to see their take on it, that, it'll be fine. We'll be able to enforce things with what we've already got in place. I just think that's a mistake personally. All right, one of the more interesting aspects is retrofit, and I touched on this earlier, but I wanted to put this slide in as a standalone because this will go directly to the heart of people who fly regular airplanes at regular AMA fields. You'll have, or in your backyard at your farm, if you're on private property somewhere, this applies to you. So you can retrofit. You will be able to go out and buy a module that will broadcast the information they require for remote ID if you're not flying at a FRIA. If you're not flying at an FAA registered airfield, then you'll be able to retrofit with a broadcast module. And more importantly than the broadcast module, they did away with the network requirement. We will touch on that as well, but thankfully they got rid of that because that was bad. I mean, you had problems with cellular reception, internet reception, data plans, SIM cards, IMEIs. I mean, when they first came out with this, I thought the cellular networks were probably just chomping at the bit and couldn't wait to get their teeth sunk into this little deal, because that would have been a whole new batch of SIM cards they could have sold for all these airplanes that would have been flying around connecting to the cellular network. So anyway, I wanted to put a special slide out there just for retrofit to let you know that if you're not in an AMA field and you want to fly in private property, you will have the ability to retrofit using a broadcast module. They spent a little bit of time clarifying what a UAS is, and I know this one goes round and round, but the bottom line in the US is that the Congress established what a UAS was in the law. So if you look at 49 USC 44801, paragraph 12, they were very clear about it in the United States Code. The term unmanned aircraft system means an unmanned aircraft and associated elements, including communication links and the components that control the unmanned or unmanned aircraft that are required for the operator to operate safely and efficiently in the national airspace system. So the FAA basically punted on this and said, no, we're not responsible. Congress told us what it is. This is what it is. And that's it. So they basically punted on that. It's not left for the imagination. All right, line of sight. This one, this is one of the ones I'm really not sure how to interpret this, because they said in the line of sight definition, they said that initial proposal was that the term line of sight means the ability of the person on the controls to be able to see the thing without any help other than corrective lenses. Then further in the rulemaking, they said, we're not going to adopt that definition of the rule. And they've determined not to adopt the definition for visual line of sight because there may be other factors impacting line of sight. With that said, while they neglected to provide a firm definition for line of sight, understand and make no mistake, everything governed in remote ID operations will require visual line of sight. Now, the weird part is, what is line of sight? Based on page 39 of the rulemaking, that's ill-defined or undefined at this point. Okay, so let's move on to number 10. This is one of the smartest things, and the thing, thankfully, common sense prevailed. The FAA is eliminating the network framework and focusing only on the broadcast solution for the time being. Notice that little caveat, for the time being. I think the technical ramifications were probably just far too great, and the concern about the impact on the cellular network was there. The ability to do things like fly a UAS to inspect power lines over distance were problematic. So I think calmer heads prevailed, and thankfully they eliminated the remote ID. This was one of my big concerns about remote ID, was the network requirement, because I used to work at a large telephone company. I know what they're after with those SIM cards. They want those connections. So, and that always means a data plan, and that means either the taxpayer is going to pay for it or the remote ID pilot's going to pay for it. But thankfully they got rid of that one. So that's out. No more remote ID USS network requirement. You do not have to connect to a network. This is broadcast only. The FAA also spent some time defining what a home-built aircraft was, because you can imagine the mess this must have created when it came down to remote ID. So what happens to a home-built aircraft? What defines a home-built aircraft? I kind of made a joke when they initially proposed that they wanted every single aircraft to be registered. I said, oh, okay, every single aircraft I own is now called a Sportster, and I'm going to ask some local police officer to prove me wrong. So, well, I think they finally had some common sense around this too, but the bottom line is that home-built aircraft are those built by people at home solely for educational or recreational purposes. So initially they had all kinds of governance in the book about, well, it's got to be more than 51%. It's got to be fabricated by the builder. And the problem with all of that rulemaking was that it was designed around their preconceived notions of what a experimental aircraft builder did. Somebody who built an actual aircraft in their garage. That's how they were thinking about the problem. And finally, thankfully, the community said, no, you don't really understand. You can buy any level of kits, from a stack of balsa to a sheet of foam to an ARF to a plug and play. They come in every different material you can imagine. We don't actually fabricate our own cameras and our own video transmitters. So using these fabrication rules, that's got to go. And they did. They got rid of that. They basically said, look, if you put it together and it's for educational and recreational use, we're going to consider that a home-built aircraft. That's another little victory in the clarification that I see in the final rulemaking. A little bit more on the home-built aircraft. The hobbyist assembling an unmanned aircraft from a complete kit that contains the parts and instructions to assemble are not responsible for meeting production requirements of the rule. However, if you're the manufacturer that produced the kit, you are responsible for the rule. So that's kind of an interesting little take on things. They're basically saying, if you're going to sell something that's compliant with the rules under remote ID, then you have to ensure, you have to certify, you have to make sure that you're compliant. But the buyer, the builder, they kind of took that burden off the civilian, right? The consumer. That's off. So if you're putting it together, you're not really required to maintain the compliance with the rule for production requirements. A home-built unmanned aircraft without remote identification can only be, okay, this is the key. This is the catch-all. The home-built aircraft, but this is AMA. So this is if you're an AMA type, right? Or if you want to fly in the cornfield. No, sorry. This is just AMA types. A home-built unmanned aircraft without remote identification can only be operated in an FAA-recognized identification area unless it can remotely identify in accordance with this rule. So what that bottom line, what this means, this is the so what moment for all of you guys that are out there flying the traditional aircraft, right? The traditional, forget about FPV, forget about cameras, forget about flight controllers and all that stuff. If you're just out flying your precision aerobatics Katana or your Warbird at an AMA field, none of this stuff really matters that much to you, other than the 3-year registration requirement. You'll have that. That doesn't go away. You still have to register every 3 years, and you get a UAS operator ID number. And that's still supposed to be on your plane, but you don't have to worry about remote ID. So you can take your plane, go to your AMA field, fly around, not worry about remote ID, have a good time, don't worry about any of this stuff. If you're not going to be in an AMA field, you are going to have to produce some ability to remote ID with a broadcast module or with the baked in standard remote ID. Okay, that's one of the keys in this entire thing. So if you're just a traditional flyer, do your thing, have fun, don't worry about it. Okay, what about my existing planes? A lot of commenters expressed concern about the definition of amateur built. This is that home built question. And how would they comply? And that's where they came up with this idea of retrofitting. So they said the FAA does not agree unmanned aircraft produced without remote identification may be flown in an FAA recognized identification area or may be upgraded or retrofitted to meet the remote identification requirements. So that was the purpose of the broadcast module, is to say you can backdate your equipment. So don't worry about it. We're not saying that if you're not in an AMA field and you have a fleet of aircraft, that fleet of aircraft is now obsolete. You can still add these broadcast modules that will be coming. So fine to do that. They're on their way, and you can add them to your plane. So if you're not in an AMA field, don't worry about it. You can add the broadcast module. We'll talk a little bit about the serial numbers and the pilot registration ID in a little bit, but I just wanted to make sure you understood that your existing planes are not necessarily obsolete because you do have an upgrade path for them. Okay? All right. Let's see. Applicability. Yeah, this is a good one. I like the way they say the rationale for linking the applicability of the operating requirements to the registration requirements is need to identify the aircraft operating in airspace and connecting it to the person that's doing the operation. So no person may operate an unmanned aircraft in the airspace of the U.S. unless it's been registered by its owner or unless the aircraft is exempted from the registration process, which is a half a pound or less. That's a 250 gram thing. So bottom line is that you still have to maintain that UAS pilot registration. They did eliminate the multi-aircraft registration. You no longer have to do that. In fact, there were some commercial entities that argued strongly against it, but the FAA said, nope. And I think what they did was they realized, because they knew that people crashed planes, they traded planes, they rebuilt planes, they swapped parts out. They talked about that in the document in detail. So I think with that in mind, they said, we really aren't going to have a way to enforce this. So you're still going to have to register as a pilot, but you can have unlimited planes as a pilot, but you do have to have that registration in the UAS system as a pilot. Okay. And there is an exemption from registration if you're under 250 grams. And I will talk a little bit about serial numbers and your registration number momentarily. We're getting to that. So hang tight. All right. The FAA considered public comments requesting the agency for exceptions to recreational unmanned operations. Here's the bottom line on all the exceptions. So it was really fascinating reading some of the comments because they came from different points of view. They came from different points of interest. And one of the key takeaways is that the FAA said, look, stop asking for exceptions. There aren't any. There's one, but there aren't any. So stop asking. They say, bottom line, the FAA believes that successfully integrating unmanned aircraft into the airspace requires the identification of unmanned aircraft. So however smart you are, or however smart you think you are, there aren't going to be exceptions. There's only 3 ways to do this. One is with the standard remote ID, the other's with a broadcast remote ID, and the third is at a FRIA. That's it. Those are the only ways around this. There aren't any exceptions. There is one, and I'll talk about the one later. And it's kind of, to me, I find it kind of fascinating that they said, no, we're not providing any exceptions, but we are going to provide one exception. It's kind of funny. But anyway, the goal here, according to the FAA, is to make sure that they can identify pilots of UAS aircraft that are posing safety and security risks. I think there's more to the goal than that, but that's what they say the goal is. It's to make sure they can identify. So don't ask for exceptions. There aren't any. They're really closing down any perceived or desired loopholes, whether or not you define yourself as a commercial interest, a hobbyist, a recreational, educational, it doesn't really matter. They're saying, nope, no exceptions. I already talked about this. They decided to take the simplified approach by going broadcast only. I put this in there again as so you could have a reference on page 63 if you want. They've removed remote identification to the broadcast only system. So no network again. That's just the standalone slide, so you have a direct reference for that one. No internet requirement. This is the other side of that coin. They're not adopting the internet requirement. You don't have to transmit elements through the internet. There are a lot of comments in there about cybersecurity, about coordinated attacks, about exposure of personal data. There's still a great deal of discussion, I think, to be had around the exposure of data, because you do have to have your certificate number and your serial number broadcast, and that's how they'll be able to correlate who's who in the zoo if they find somebody doing something they don't like. So there's a lot of discussion in the comments about that, about misuse of that information, about police misuse of that information, about public misuse of that information. So there's still a lot of conversation about that, but the FAA is trying to say, look, we built a system with all federal security standards in place, so it's fine. Don't worry about it. It's in place. That's what we're using. So while there's no internet requirement to broadcast live over the internet, you do have to broadcast. Just understand that the broadcast thing is going to be local, right? Local only. It's not going to be something that some dude in Russia can get their hands on and say, hey, we know where John's flying. All right. What frequencies for broadcast? This is another one that actually came up in the Discord server. And the bottom line here is it's Part 15 devices. So everything that we consumers in the US fly is regulated by CFR Part 15, and that governs all the ISM bands. So 2.4, 5.8, 900, 868, whatever the ISM frequencies are that are governed by Part 15, that's where they expect the broadcast capabilities to occur. So one thing's for sure, it won't be 2.4. That much I can pretty much assure you. And they can't use the ham bands either. So they're not going to be using ham bands. They have to be things that are generally available on smartphones, tablets, or other similarly available commercial devices like routers. So think 2.4 and 5.8. My guess is because it's going to be local, and because you can't interfere with control systems on 2.4, which is the preponderance of devices, my guess is it's probably going to come in at 5.8. Just guessing, but that's where I think it'll land. The receivers must be able to receive the broadcast identification information without reliance on an internet connection. All right. Yeah, Bruce says 27. Yeah, that might be a good use, Bruce, except 72 and 27. Yeah, I forgot about those, but those are longer range, right? But anyway, yeah, that's a possibility too, because we've abandoned those, but they also might be taken up by the broadcast spectrums too. I have a feeling those are sold off for cell phone use or something, but I don't know. 27 or 72 are possible as well. Okay, here's the one that kind of sucks. This is the no excuses line. It says the person operating the remote ID or remote aircraft must ensure. So yeah, this is the one that kind of sucks. You must ensure the unmanned aircraft is broadcasting the standard remote ID message elements. And they even go so far as to say for the standard elements, they have to have a power on self-check. They have to make sure they're working before they depart. And if there's a problem, the pilot has to be made aware of it. And there was even a great deal of conversation about what happens about notification that the remote ID transmission has failed. You know, how do you land? How do you notify the pilot to land? So the bottom line is that you have to make sure that it's working, and it has to be on from takeoff to shutdown. So takeoff to shutdown, that's the period of time that the remote transmission has to be in effect. All right, message elements. I'm not going to go through every one of these. I'm going to leave it up there so you can screenshot it. But basically, it's lat, long, altitude of the station and the plane and the airspeed of the plane. That's the bottom line here. So I'll leave that up there just so you can screenshot it. And by the way, I'll put a link to this presentation in the description. I'll upload it later tonight, but I'll put it on rcvideoreviews.com and you can download it if you need to. So these are the message elements required for the standard remote identification. There is a difference for the broadcast version. The broadcast version, they don't require a GPS transmission of the controller location, only the takeoff point. And the theory on that was that it's likely, especially in line of sight flying, that the takeoff point should suffice as the controller location, especially if you're flying within line of sight. So in other words, if you're flying within a quarter mile and a cop shows up, he's probably going to be able to figure out who's flying the drone. That's what they're trying to say. Okay, on the broadcast modules, previously mentioned, the broadcast module concept is a retrofit. It allows unmanned aircraft without remote ID to be operated outside of FRIAs, and the FAA is also allowing a pathway for existing unmanned aircraft to have certain broadcast capabilities already integrated to be upgraded. So I put this one on there mainly to point at the flight computers. So I think the idea here, what they're trying to say, and what you should probably expect is in tools like iNav or Betaflight or CleanFlight or any of those flight computers you use with OSD capabilities that are, by the way, broadcasting on a standard frequency of 5.8, they can be upgraded to also emit this information as necessary. So that's why I wanted to throw that one in there, is because they're saying clearly they're allowing a pathway for existing unmanned aircraft that have certain broadcast capabilities to be upgraded. And yeah, that's easy to do. Think about a camera. I mean, how many how many FPV cameras do you have that do things like your channel and your name? You can program your name, the frequency that you're on, the band that you're on, the power level, all that stuff. Wouldn't be too hard to upgrade that type of equipment to include things like your lat and long, but that would require GPS feed. So maybe better out of a flight computer. Yeah, this was a slide where this is a gotcha slide. On page 84, it says all of your home built unmanned aircraft can be produced without remote ID. And the bottom line is you can either fly at an AMA field or use remote ID. This really put it into a nice little bow, made it nice and simple. You can be operated without a remote ID at a FRIA, or you can operate outside of a FRIA with a remote ID. It's a light switch, man. You're either on or off. And that's what page 84 did. It wrapped it up in a tidy little bow. You can either go to an AMA field or use a remote ID, your call. It's one or the other though. All right, standard versus broadcast. I touched on this a little bit earlier. The exception of the unmanned aircraft takeoff location and altitude, that's what I was mentioning earlier. That's the difference. In the standard module, you're going to provide the control location in the broadcast. In the broadcast module, the takeoff location is what's sent out in the broadcast. So that replaces the control station location and altitude and the emergency status. By the way, they also said for the emergency status, that will be a requirement in the standard, but it's not going to be a requirement in the broadcast module. And the reason for that was they felt that backfitting a broadcast module to understand if the aircraft is in an emergency status, like say you have a stuck servo, or an ESC that's skipping, it would be impossible to implement. So they did away with that on the broadcast module as well. You only need to do the takeoff location, not the actual control location in the broadcast. So, and there's no emergency status requirement in the broadcast module element. Yeah, here's more on the emergency status. They're not requiring an unmanned aircraft with remote ID broadcast to broadcast an indication of the emergency status. As it says at the very bottom line, too many technological challenges to require at this time. All right. When do I broadcast? They even clarified this too, because there's different startup procedures and shutdown procedures. So they basically say, look, you have to broadcast from takeoff to shutdown. It's real simple, real simple. All right. Freedom. you can get freedom from remote ID only if, so they kind of mention on page 95, the majority of unmanned aircraft in the US must identify remotely. And that's where they expect this to exist, by the way. They expect most of the flying to be outside of FRIAs. That's what they expect. So mainly the operation without remote ID is allowed if the person manipulating the flight controls is able to see the aircraft at all times and within the boundaries of a FRIA. So if you go to a FRIA and you decide to fly over the horizon, yeah, you're back down to remote ID. So if you decide to fly past the fence line, you're on remote ID. You just have to keep that in mind. There's another, and I told you earlier, I'd tell you what the other exception was. Here's the other exception. Under Part 89.120, when the administrator authorizes operation without remote ID for aeronautical research or to show compliance with regulations. So what they're saying here is manufacturers can have the exception. Manufacturers can have an exception. So that's the one exception they made, manufacturers. Hey, I'm going to take a quick little pause here. We got right now 97 viewers and 11 likes. If this is interesting, even if you don't like the message, I would appreciate it if you hit that like button. It'll help with video placement later. So definitely do me a favor and hit that like button if you're still tracking with me. Okay, here's another catch-all that I thought was clever, and it shows that they were probably getting advised because one of the first things I thought about was, all right, I got to make sure the thing is in my airplane and it works and it's transmitting, but what happens if I wrap a piece of tinfoil around the antenna? So it says in Part 96, a person operating a standard remote identification or an unmanned aircraft with remote ID must continue to identify remotely when operating in an FAA recognized identification area. So if you have the module in the plane, you have to have it on. So you can't just wrap it in tinfoil and say, well, I'm at my AMA field, so I'm not gonna broadcast. If you have it, you're supposed to broadcast, which I thought was kind of interesting. They're just that's the first encroachment, right? Yeah. Bruce says smash that. Yeah, you got to smash that like button with authority. That's right, Bruce. Thanks, man. All right. No privacy, no exceptions. Yeah, this is one I don't like. I really didn't like this because there were a lot of comments concerning privacy. And one of the main things, if you think about it, if people don't like drones or don't like what drones represent, or they're afraid of them, you've seen the videos, right? They're all over the place. But you could be approached because you're broadcasting your location information in the broadcast. So a lot of commenters were concerned about that. And we are sharing the control station location publicly. And here's the FAA's comment, and I put this in red. And by the way, going forward, there will be a few more things in red, which means I kind of like, what the heck were they thinking with this? The FAA says, yeah, we know the requirement is necessary. The requirement as proposed is necessary to meet the core objectives of this rulemaking to promote the safety and efficiency of the airspace of the United States. So I don't know where they get efficiency out of that, but the bottom line is you have no right to privacy here. No expectation of privacy, so don't expect it. You have to broadcast where you are, which brings up a whole slew of other concerns we'll touch on in just a little bit. So in the US, we have this thing called the Fifth Amendment. It's the right to not incriminate ourselves. It's part of our Constitution, and that's one of the other beefs I have with the whole thing. Let's be honest here. You're basically broadcasting so that if you do something you're not supposed to do, they have evidence that you did it. And I have a problem with that because in the US, we have that right here. If I'm asked questions by an officer, I don't have to answer. I can say, I refuse to answer that question. I don't want to answer that question. And they can't do anything to me about it. So it's just a right. And that basically is getting kicked to the curb here because we have these remote ID requirements on our planes, and we have to broadcast what we're doing. We have to tell everybody this is what I'm doing. I'm at 450 feet and I'm going, over the fence line, and you have to tell. So the right against self-incrimination and remote ID is right out the door. And I know what they're going to say. They're going to say, well, it's a privilege. Well, so is walking down the street, but they still can't take my Fifth Amendment right away from me. So I expect at some point, I think this will be a lawsuit. I think some smart lawyer in the US is going to get a hold of one of these cases and say, nah, man, you have to throw that evidence out because you're asking my client to incriminate themselves with information. So they say this is to me, it's kind of cute. The availability of this information will promote accountability and trust. Well, thanks, Uncle Ho. Here's another one. This is another one of my, so, I'm a licensed pilot. And one of the first things that I learned becoming a licensed pilot was that it is literally, it's a federal offense to interfere with the pilot in command of an aircraft. You can't do it. So this page 121 says, though the FAA acknowledges the concerns expressed by commenters regarding personal safety and the marginal risk created by broadcasting control station's location, the FAA emphasizes that there are statutory prohibitions against interfering with an aircraft. Yeah, there are statutory limitations against interfering with an aircraft, but read the red line on the bottom. There's a prohibition of interference with crew members on board an aircraft. It doesn't say anything about a guy who's flying his UAS in a park, following all the rules, below 400 feet, line of sight, got a spotter, doing everything he's supposed to do, of not being accosted by somebody who doesn't like drones. Right? This needs to be modified because they're saying, yeah, you can't interfere with the pilot in command or a steward or stewardess. You can't interfere with the flight attendant. You can't do any of that stuff. But if he's on the ground, that doesn't count. So we're going to apply all the rules of in-flight aviation to you guys, except the one that protects you from interference. And I think they need to update that one. I think they have to go back and look at it and say, hey, if they're going to treat and ask people to be certified and licensed and carry certification numbers and follow FAA rules, that they also ought to afford them the accommodations and protections that are afforded to aircraft crew people as well. Range of broadcast. On page 146, the FAA affirms the broadcast requirement is limited to the proximity of the aircraft. So again, don't have to go out crazy range with this. It's not going to be a Dragon Link transmitter on here. Everything will be limited to proximity of the aircraft. So nearby, that's the bottom line. This is the one where I say it's not an issue until it's an issue. The FAA says its approach is based on the fundamental assumption that regulated entities will comply with the rules. And I see a lot of people coming in saying, I'm going to be a victim. I'm going to be a criminal. I'm already not complying. Will not comply. It's all in there. And you're going to do what makes you happy and do your thing. I'm not going to offer much of an opinion there. I know what I'm going to do. But anyway, assumption that regulated entities will comply with the rules. The FAA does not assume non-compliance. I just almost believe that's naive. I don't know. I don't know. They recognize that not all entities will comply. No kidding. I mean, really? I'm shocked. Not all entities will comply. Remote identification allows appropriate authorities to identify the operator. This is my favorite one. I put this in red for follow-up or education on how to operate safely. So you got a guy like Bruce. You guys all know Bruce, right? Bruce has been flying for, I don't know, Bruce, I don't want to date you, but a long time. He's been flying for a long time. So you're going to have a 24-year-old police officer who's never even seen a radio-controlled airplane in his life or her life approach a guy like Bruce and say, listen, Bruce, here's what you're doing wrong, friend. I mean, come on. This isn't about education. This isn't about education. This is about fines. Who's that guy in Philadelphia that just got stacked up with $184,000 in fines? That's what this is. This isn't education. Give me a break. Nothing I've seen in here is about education. Nothing. This is not about education. This is about oversight and governance. That's what this is about. There's nothing in here that indicates to me they've done anything to educate. And by the way, I sure would not look to my local police force for education on how to safely operate my aircraft. Sorry. Oh yeah, by the way, I'm a licensed pilot with 1,000 hours of military aircraft. So you're going to teach me how to fly? Thanks. All right. Here's the other part that I just find offensive. Page 176, they emphasize that the use of remote identification data by law enforcement is bound by all constitutional restrictions, except that pesky Fifth Amendment where you have to tell on yourself. And I think I misspelled amendment. Sorry, I didn't do. There we go. Yeah, so except for that pesky Fifth Amendment, everything else constitutionally applies. The purpose of this rule is to provide a tool for identifying an unmanned aircraft and locating its operators so we can stick them with fines. Oh, and to help local law enforcement engage in threat discrimination. Because, when you're flying over those empty mountain ranges and cow fields and lakes and deserts, yeah, you got to be worried about things like risk discrimination. Or I don't get it. So, yeah, that's what they say, but, that's what's in the book. Page 176 if you want to look it up. I'm stuck here. Let's see. Oh, the AMA did well. And by the way, I'm an AMA member. I fly at AMA fields. I love the AMA. So, you know, I don't want you to misconstrue what I'm saying here. AMA, good job. Good job. You protected your constituency. Well done. I applaud the AMA. Let's give a round of applause for the AMA. First thing is they removed the 12-month limitation on time to submit the applications. Thank God for that, because the initial one, they really, and I'm going to talk about this in a moment, but it was clear that they were trying to constrict and choke out AMA fields. Clear. No mistake about it in the first round, but they got rid of the 12-month limitation to submit new applications, so that's great. The criteria will be described in greater detail in the advisory circular on FAA recognized identification areas, which will be published following this rulemaking. So that goes to what will happen with information required for the application. And it also, the rule removes the prohibition on the reapplication if your location has expired or if it's been terminated, as long as the condition that led to the termination are no longer in effect. So why that's so important, and why I believe that was hugely important, was because if you, let's say for my AMA field, we're on a county reclaimed landfill. So if the county ever said, hey, we need to move you guys down because we're going to do some maintenance on this thing, so we're going to move you down to the parcel right over there, under the prior rules, that's it. Our club's done, over. So they do allow for reapplication in the new rulemaking. So that was really a big benefit. And they also got rid of the 12-month constraint, where after 12 months, there would be no further applications. That's also been removed as well. So that's good. AMA, you know, hopefully they were involved in getting the FAA to see the error of its ways. And by the way, it's in big red letters coming up here on what their initial intention was. The purpose of the recognized identification area is to help accommodate traditional model aircraft. That bottom line here. So if you guys are part of the AMA and you send your money to the AMA, you ought to write to them and say thank you, because it looks to me like this is one of the other very few exceptions that are in remote ID, and that's the traditional aircraft at AMA fields. So anyone that's flying traditional airplanes at AMA fields, you're basically exempt. You don't have to, the only thing you have is the 3-year renewal. That's it. $5, that's it. So AMA did a good job protecting your interests there, and you guys make sure you say something to the AMA representation, because they were obviously at the table and they were persuasive. A little bit more on the AMA. The force is strong with this one. One of the concerns for people that are not part of the AMA is they'd be forced to join the AMA. And that's one of the downsides, I guess, if you're not an AMA member today, is that if you want that freedom of flying without these requirements and without running afoul of the rules, you're going to have to go to an AMA field. The FAA says they considered that CBOs, AMA, and educational institutions can perform an important function in promoting safety and in recreational UAS flying. There's a downside to that. And while I understand that the AMA is superb on the standard format, I think there's a great deal of work that needs to be done at the AMA level involving the unmanned FPV-oriented crew and crowd. Because I know for a fact AMA fields shun them. They look down on them. They don't welcome them. They relegate them to a corner. They say, if you want to fly a drone, go over there and do it. I think that's going to have to change over time, because honestly, I really do think that the FPV / flight controller / automated mode flying is here to stay. It's not going to go away. And what's happening right now is you're kind of being forced into the AMA field. So I think there's some work to be done on AMA's part, educating and kind of shifting the focus to encourage those types of pilots to become part of the group. One more concession for the AMA is the 12 calendar month limitation on application. The FAA will begin accepting applications, and they put this insert date 60 days and 18 months after the date of publication in the Federal Register. So there's going to be some time. Just do yourself a favor. If you're a member of the AMA, make sure you talk to your leadership and make sure you have an understanding of what's going on, and make sure your field gets in on the list. That's all. The AMA probably has a strategy for submitting all of their active fields. That's my guess, but it'd be worth understanding that to make sure your field doesn't get left out. All right. Yeah, here's the one. I put this, this is the first one I really put some big red letters in, because they said the FAA has determined there will be a continued need for FAA recognized identification areas, and that these areas will not phase out as originally conceived. That one pisses me off, because I'm going to be honest with you, that's how they went in. And anyone that read the initial rulemaking knew that that's what they were trying to do. So again, this is another one where you got to tip the hat to the AMA, because whatever they said, and read the bottom, comments about the potential impacts on education and the recreational community were persuasive. I did, just for argument's sake, I did a search on how many times the FAA disagrees. 45 times. 45 times. The FAA said, we really don't care what you guys think. This is what we think. We have 45 times. So whatever the AMA did, they earned their money, because they number one, they got the rules changed so that these areas will not phase out as originally conceived. They're dirty rats for putting that in there. That was their strategy, and I'm really not happy with the FAA for that. But thankfully, we had the AMA protecting those interests, and they were persuasive. So again, make sure, tip your hat to the AMA. They did a good job. All right. So one of the few intelligent outcomes, the FAA has determined there is no need for the agency to issue serial numbers to the existing unmanned aircraft fleet at this time. This goes to this idea of having a fleet. If you have 30 or 40 planes, you're going to go back and add serial numbers, and what's the format, and who's going to regulate those, and what if I use serial number 1 and 1.1 and 1.18, it's just a mess. So they finally acknowledged that no, they don't need to do that. What they will do, though, is your broadcast module will be registered to you. So your certificate number, your UAS pilot number, that's going to be registered to you, and so will that serial number. So that's how they're going to connect the dots. So when your serial number on your broadcast module is flying, they're going to know that belongs to you. Here's a public service announcement. Know before you buy, and I'm just doing this for the community. I don't want anyone to get screwed out of their money. And make no mistake, guys, there are going to be some unscrupulous actors out there. Okay. So make sure you understand this part. This is one you probably want to screenshot this as well. Look at page 245. The unmanned aircraft or the broadcast module displays a label indicating that it meets requirements of Part 89. Part 89. Remember that. It has to be prominent and permanently affixed to the aircraft or the module. So you're going to have, what's going to happen is, you're going to get people out there selling, hey, get your FAA broadcast module. We're first to market. We're selling them for $20. Don't be a sucker. Wait until you know that it's a Part 89 approved device, and then you should be safe to buy it. That means it's compliant, and it's going to work a lot like Part 15 radio devices, where they have to do a self-certification and attestation that it does comply. So that's the deal on these broadcast modules. Make sure it's Part 89. If I were you, I'd wait for the review community to get their hands on them first, and then once you know, because we've got time here. We got time. It's like 30 months. There's time. You don't have to run right out and buy the first thing you see. Wait for the review community or the groups, RC groups. Wait for those guys to get their hands on them first, test them out and say, yeah, this is correct. And then go get them. But don't be a fool with your money and wait. Wait for those certifications, the correctly certified parts to hit the market before you start spending your money. All right. In other words, we couldn't figure it out. They will no longer revise Part 48 to require the individual registration of all small unmanned aircraft. This is great news. This is one of the other ones that I was concerned about, because I always say you can eat an elephant one bite at a time. And I figured they were fleecing us by simply saying, look, we just want you to register. It's $5. What's the big deal? That gets you compliant, right? You get malleable. You're like, $5, whatever. I'll pay the $5. But then they came out with a rulemaking. They said, oh yeah, about that $5. Yeah, it's going to be $5 per plane this year. And then next year it's 10, and next year it's 15. So I kind of saw this one coming, and thankfully they came to their senses and said, nah, we're not going to be able to figure that out, because I know that the concern was going to be, we've got every single airplane out there is called a Sportster or a Timber. What's a Timber? You're going to have Bob, Officer Bob looking at Sergeant Davis going, what's a Timber, dude? I don't know. It looks like a Timber to me. Okay, it's a Timber. I mean, can you imagine that? It's just a joke. So the bottom line is you only have to register once for all your unmanned aircraft, which is super cool. That was a win. I was really concerned about that one, because if you have a lot of planes in your hangar, you were going to need to register those, but not anymore. That's gone. All right, costs. Bottom line, owners will pay $5 once every 3 years. That's the bottom line. See page 297 for more details on that. But yep, $5 every 3 years. Serial numbers. I talked about this, just touched on it briefly. The unique serial number of each standard remote ID. So every standard remote ID that you get will have to have a unique serial number, or remote identification broadcast module that allows the agency and law enforcement to distinguish among unmanned aircraft with the same registration number. So if you have a registration number, XYZ, your serial number that goes with either the aircraft you're flying or the broadcast module you've attached to the aircraft you're flying, that's the unique identifier that's going to come back to you. Home-built aircraft do not need to comply with serial number requirements. Yeah, you don't worry about serial numbers if you're using a home-built thing, or if you're sticking your own broadcast module. The broadcast module or the standard remote ID covers the serial number requirements. So they simplified that for us, thankfully. That's another kind of burden that we don't have to face. Home-built aircraft are accepted from the production requirements of this rule, including the requirements for a serial number. That's on page 306 if you want to look that one up. This is a big one. ADS-B is not permitted. I think this is another one of those come to their senses moments where they said, wait a minute, we're going to take ADS-B and put 1,000, 2,000 new aircraft on here. We're going to get flushed out. The system's not going to work. It wasn't designed for that. Somebody came in and said, no, that's a bad idea. So ADS-B is out. If you were worried about that, that was a concern of yours, that's gone. No longer part of the deal. In fact, they specifically say don't use it. It's prohibited unless otherwise authorized. And there is some concern about some of the early adopters that actually added ADS-B, and I think they're going to make accommodations for them. But for the rest of us, no, you don't need to worry about ADS-B. Okay, timelines. Yeah, Bruce says there's not enough address space to put ADS-B out on drones. Yeah, so someone came to their senses. Okay, regarding timelines, you got 18 months for producers, and that's after the effective date, which is like 60 days after incorporation of the Federal Registrar. So we're looking at about 20 months, depending on when they get it into the Federal Registrar, and that's for producers to start producing the drones with the standard remote ID. After that, it's not cumulative. Notice that the key term here is the effective date. So the drone producers or the aircraft producers, they have 18 months after the effective date. The operators have 30 months after the effective date. So another year after the drones start hitting the market, then the operators have to become compliant with the remote ID rules in this breakout. All right. So 18 months from the effective date for producers, 30 months from the effective date on the operator side. I don't know what the effective date is. It depends on when it goes in the Federal Register. Okay, cost for these modules. Operators with a desire to operate beyond the boundaries of a FRIA will be required to purchase broadcast equipment. They basically said, yeah, we know it's going to cost more, just what it is. The FAA expects the incremental cost to a consumer between the range of 20 and 50 per unit. To me, I kind of expect these to be a lot like a VTX. And for that reason, I think early on, the early units probably will come in on the high end, but cost and competition will drive the price down. I don't see any reason these should be any more expensive than a standard little VTX. That's what I expect. So FAA estimates between 20 and 50 bucks. This one, expectations. So the FAA has greatly reduced the burden for recreational operators. I have to agree with that. I mean, as painful as this is, and I don't like the idea of governance and oversight to this level either. But as painful as it is, they did actually reduce the burden. You have to give them the credit for that because of that network thing, because of the registering every aircraft, putting serial numbers on everything. I mean, it was looking pretty nasty there for a while. So this is not as bad as it looked when we went in. So I think the people who were involved in consulting and people who issued the request for comments, they did a good job. They had some convincing arguments and at least maybe kind of dulled the edge of the sword a little bit. So the network connectivity requirement's been removed, which is awesome. That's a good one because that was going to cost real money. The proposed requirement to register each aircraft is not adopted. And here's one that kind of kills me. The FAA is continually engaging the recreational community. I don't know. They never asked me anything. I don't know that they ever asked Joshua anything or any of the other guys in the U.S. that run big companies. I don't know what they've asked them. Maybe they talked to the AMA, but I don't know. They continually engage the recreational community. That's lip service. I'm sorry. All right. Regarding enforcement, there's a bold line at the bottom of this one that just basically says, wait, I got to back up on this because somebody put in a comment on the comment sheet on this one. And by the way, we're on page 359 at this point. The FAA recognizes that equipping, so the comment said, who's going to train these cops in police departments? And the FAA, and the person gave numbers. So the FAA came out and said, well, we know that equipping 18,000 cops or 18,000 police departments with technology to access this data and then training the 750,000 officers to use it has costs. Yeah, we know that. The regulatory impact analysis for the rule identifies the safety and security benefits of identification to distinguish compliant operations from non-compliant operations. And the bottom line is they said, yeah, it's up to the security and law enforcement entities to incur the cost and relative to the scope of their needs. And that's all happening amid a nationwide defund the police movement, which, I mean, you got to, I guess the law enforcement leadership in the country has to be kind of scratching your heads going, wait a minute. You're taking 30% of our budget and now we have to go to the park and bust Bruce for flying his quad? Come on. I mean, I almost just want to know what's going on in the leadership offices of nationwide police entities. They have to be looking at this going, what did they just say? We're doing what now? I don't know. Like I said, I think this isn't an incident until this is an incident. What I think this does is it gives them teeth after the fact. That's what I think it does. To give them teeth after the fact. Okay, so here's the close. The FAA acknowledges that the relief provided in this rule will still be considered a burden. Yeah, just a little. Not as bad as originally. I mean, we have to give them that. It's not as bad as it was. That's for sure. So it'll still be considered a burden by some operators. Nonetheless, the rule will create a safe and secure airspace and is a stepping stone toward integration of increasingly complex UAS operations. That's like a thanks Uncle Ho again, man. You're looking out for us. And I fail to understand. And I'm not trying to be a wise guy, but how is this oversight going to provide additional safety? Because nothing in this documentation that I've read had anything to do with safety. Nothing. There isn't a single word here that says don't fly your drone near an airplane. I mean, maybe there is, but I didn't find it. I did skip a few pages, as I skimmed through it, but I fail to understand how this provides additional safety. I just don't get it. So anyway, more to be seen on that, I guess. And maybe the idea is that the AMA will hopefully take a larger role. And, I guess that's it. Other than that, it depends on compliance, but yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not buying the safety argument. I mean, I'd like for my airways to be safe. I'd like to know when I get on a recreational or a commercial airliner to take a trip somewhere, that I'll have some knucklehead sitting on the end of the airport with his freaking DJI trying to take pictures of my jet wash, but I don't see how this documentation that I've seen so far, addresses the safety concern. So that's it. That is the bottom line. That's everything you need to know. That's my take on it anyway, guys. And I know there's going to be a lot of talk on this subject over the coming weeks and months. And The good news is it's not as bad as we thought. It's not as financially burdensome as we thought it would be. And I don't think the compliance is really going to be too challenging for those of you who are used to flying traditional planes at traditional fields. For those of you who like to fly anything at non-traditional fields, for those of you who want to fly anything at non-traditional fields, you're going to have a little bit of work to do. You know, you're going to have to get yourself brushed up on the rules. You're going to have to maybe get one of those modules and get yourself queued up and ready to comply if you choose to be one of the people who's going to comply with these rules. So, that's all I've got. Guys are way too much in the comments field for me to go back. I guess the best way to engage after this is in the comments field of the video. Again, 150 users. I definitely would appreciate it if you guys, before we break for the night, would go ahead and hit that like button. That'll help with placement. And I definitely appreciate all the conversation and the insightful comments that went by. I know I couldn't get to all of them tonight, but there was a lot about, a lot scrolling by as I went through the material. So, Bruce said, they said the same about registration. How's that made the sky safer? Yeah, Bruce, that's exactly where I'm coming from, man. And I know what you think about safety because I've watched you for years. And, you know, the idea is don't be an idiot, don't be an idiot. Just act and behave accordingly, for the situation. And that's the problem I have with what they're doing here. I don't see that. It's not that I'm not trying to be a difficult person, but if you want to make us safer, then do things that make us safer. The education, man. How about talking? This guy in Philadelphia, I watched his follow-up video after the fines were levied, and he got on YouTube and he said, I just want to know where I can fly. Well, I mean, it's not in downtown Philadelphia. We know that, but don't you think that's a problem? You got a guy like that saying, I just want to know where I can fly. That's a problem. That's a problem. That's not addressed in these rules. So I'm not sure. I'm with you, Bruce. I don't understand how they think this makes us safer, but yeah, glad to help. I'm glad you guys were able to join tonight. I appreciate everyone's participation. And hey, if you're new to RC Video Reviews, hit the subscribe button too. I'd love to have you join us. And we do have a Discord server. I'll be on there tonight. I'll have that Discord link in the description as well. So appreciate everyone's participation tonight. I hope you all have a great evening. Good luck with the new rules, and there'll be more. We'll talk about this some more. That's all I've got for tonight. Take it easy.